All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Here we are again. I hope you guys are having a great week. Today we're going to finally get to talk about United States history. That is, we now have a country with the ratification of the Constitution, which was officially ratified in 1788, although it would take until 1789 for all of the 13 states to ratify the document. But once that happens, we of course have to follow the dictates of that, and we have to elect ourselves a president. And this of course means that we are going to select the best and the brightest, if you will. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about political campaigns and elections at this point in our history is that people did not necessarily run for office. It's not like contemporary elections where, years in advance, people are running for office. They're trying to get you to vote for them. Rather, presidents during this time stood for office. That is, people simply put their name into the bucket, and if they were elected, then you would be informed, hey, the people from these various states elected you. And that's what happens with George Washington. George Washington will be elected. He is probably the most popular American at this time, and he is the only president to ever get all of the electoral votes unanimously. Okay, he in fact does this twice. He gets elected during his first term and his second term. But just understand that these campaigns, these elections, these early elections, and really we're talking about elections up until about, I would argue, the election of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. But before that time, folks just voted for those people that they thought were the best and the brightest. Now, that's going to change later on in our political history. Eventually, people will become loyal to the party, and they look to the party for favors and jobs rather than looking to the person. And so, in other words, it doesn't really matter who the person is that we are voting for. It just matters that we vote for the party. That's not how things worked in the election when Washington was elected. And largely that's because there were no political parties at the time. In fact, one of the focuses for this week is going to be looking at the formation of political parties. And what's interesting is that many of our founding fathers, John Adams, for example, they vehemently opposed political parties because they believed that political parties would create faction, fissures, and division within the American Republic, and in the end, create division. But nonetheless, political parties will form, and we'll talk briefly about that. But one of the things you need to understand with the election of George Washington and other presidents at the time is that these folks tended to be the better and brightest and aristocratic, if you will, of American society. I wouldn't say that the majority of our first presidents were common folk. That is, they didn't necessarily understand the plight of the common man. They tended to be well educated. They tended to be aristocratic, wealthy planters. Many of them owned slaves. In fact, all but one president in the first five owned slaves. John Adams won't, but the others will. And so the initial election of George Washington is not really surprising. I mean, this is the man who was the president of the convention. He was the man who fought the war, right? And now he's going to be the man to lead it. Now, once he's elected, he's not super stoked about it because Washington is very concerned about what posterity is going to think about him, and he thinks about all the blunders that he's going to make. Here you've got the entire world watching what you're going to do. And in many ways, George Washington is what we call a precedent president. And that is, he set a number of important precedents for Americans to follow, some of which we're still following to this very day. For example, George Washington refused to run for a third term, which he would have been elected to had he chose to do so. But today we have laws in place that state that presidents can only serve 2 terms of 4 years each term. That, in fact, did not become a legal precedent until after Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected to 4 terms. After he died, there was a law put into place that said, no, you can't serve more than 2 terms. But every president up till Franklin Roosevelt simply adopted the precedent that George Washington put into place, 2 terms. But a lot of other significant precedents happened during Washington's administration, and a lot of them have to do with foreign policy. And we're going to be talking about foreign policy this week. But one of the things that becomes very central to Washington's administration is this idea that the United States needs to be isolationist and neutral. And I think neutral is probably a better word to use here. Part of the reasons why Washington himself moves more towards neutrality is because the French Revolution breaks out during his administration. I believe it's 1789 is when that occurs. And eventually the French, who had allied themselves with the United States, says, hey, it's time for you to pay the favor back. And there's divisions within Washington's cabinet about what he should do. And he ultimately sets forth this idea known as the Neutrality Proclamation. And you can see throughout all of Washington's kind of foreign policies that he wants to remain neutral. He does not want to have permanent alliances. In the Neutrality Proclamation, he states that the United States will be friendly towards all warring conflict, that is, all warring powers, right? We're not going to be enemies towards one and friendly towards another. Instead, we'll just be friendly to everyone, but we're also not going to get involved, right? So we'll be friendly towards all of you, but we're not going to send troops into the fight to help any one of you. We might continue to trade, but other than that, we're not going to go much further than that. Washington reiterates this in his farewell address, which is published 6 months or so before he decides to leave office. It's in fact where he tells the world that he's not going to run for a third term. But he basically says, to the Americans, be sure to not get entangled in foreign alliances, right? Don't permanently ally yourself with people, because if you do, that's going to basically suck the United States into problems that don't need to be ours. Now, this isn't Washington saying that we shouldn't have any alliances ever. He's simply saying, make your alliances temporary. Okay, and there's a number of different foreign policy movements that take place during Washington's administration. We can see the Jay Treaty is one of these. The Neutrality Proclamation is another. His farewell address again. And then there's some other foreign policy issues that you'll see during John Adams's administration. You see this chiefly with the XYZ affair. There's a quasi naval conflict that breaks out between the United States and France, and this is largely because of a treaty that Washington suggested we make. It's known as Jay's Treaty, where we actually gave some trade agreements to the British, and the French didn't like that so much because we had initially, during the American Revolution, made a treaty with the French saying we wouldn't do that, and then we went ahead and did that, and so the French declared this quasi-naval war against the United States, and John Adams is going to attempt to address that, and it sort of blows up in his face. But there's a lot of important precedents set there. And these kind of precedents of neutrality and isolationism, they continue throughout U.S. history. You see it reinforced in the Monroe Doctrine. And then even during World War I, World War II, the United States tries to remain neutral and in many ways isolated from those conflicts until, of course, it becomes apparent that we're going to get involved in both of those wars. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. But there's also some other domestic issues that go on in the United States. And some of these domestic issues create political parties. They create political faction. Now, what you want to be aware is that during Washington and John Adams's administrations, two political parties develop. One of them is called the Federalist Party. And the Federalist Party is not entirely different from the Federalists that we talked about before when we talked about the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists would be people like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams. These are folks who were looking for a stronger federal government. They wanted more intervention in the lives of people. Alexander Hamilton is really kind of the focal person of the Federalists and the Federalist Party. And some of the things that he wants to achieve during Washington's administration, and he is the Secretary of the Treasury during Washington's administration, is he wants to implement a number of economic reforms which would really grow the scope and scale of the federal government. And this would be things like creating a national debt. It would be things like assuming all the debt from each of the 13 states and letting the federal government do that. It would be things like creating a national bank of the United States to oversee the loaning and the business of the country. And Hamilton really thought that the best and the brightest, the elite, the aristocratic, they should be the ones really investing into this bank. They should be the ones overseeing all this process because in his mind, he knew the will of the people better than other people could. The problem with Alexander Hamilton's proposals is that they weren't necessarily constitutional. In fact, one of the things you're going to find, one of the reasons why the second party will develop is because of a dispute between how the Constitution should be interpreted. Should it be interpreted loosely? And just so you know, the Federalists interpreted the Constitution loosely. That is, they would look at the Constitution and Alexander Hamilton would say, hey, I want to make a national bank. And in his head, he would think, well, it doesn't necessarily say in the Constitution that the government can create a bank, but it's implied that it can create a national bank. In fact, one of the things I think I failed to mention before was that Article 1, Section 8 creates a clause known as the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. And it basically states that Congress has a bunch of powers, that has a bunch of things that they can do. And at the very end of Article 1, Section 8, it states, and Congress can make any law which is necessary and proper to ensure that it's able to complete these objectives. Well, one side would ask, well, what does the Constitution allow or not allow? Federalists tended to say, well, even if the Constitution doesn't expressly say something can be done, it might imply it. On the other side, you have a group of people mainly represented by Thomas Jefferson, and they're referred to as the Republicans. At least that's what they called themselves. Some folks refer to them as the Democratic Republicans, although Thomas Jefferson and his cohort would never have used the word democratic. These words get a little bit confusing because the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans of the 18th century and 19th century, they are not the Democrats or Republicans of today. And so historians tend to refer to the other political party as the Jeffersonians because, again, Thomas Jefferson is kind of their focal point. And they disagree in many ways with the Federalists. The Jeffersonians think that the Constitution should be interpreted very strictly. That is, the government can only do expressly what the Constitution says. Jefferson once stated that if we allow the Constitution to have implied powers, then basically the power of the federal government can grow so broad that ultimately there is no definition of what powers they can and can't wield, ultimately giving the federal government basically a boundless amount of authority over the lives of the people. And there are also some major other differences between the Federalists and the the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. The Jeffersonians tended to be pro-French. The Jeffersonians tended to be more working class, agrarian farmers. They tended, that is, the Jeffersonians tended to not have a lot of resources, or how do I say this? They weren't necessarily super invested in manufacturing. On the other hand, the Federalists were the exact opposite. They were very pro-British. Alexander Hamilton was very much wanted the United States to become a manufacturing powerhouse. In fact, Jefferson didn't want to manufacture anything. He wanted the United States to be a virtuous United States. And the way that you did that was by giving land to small-scale farmers, right? These white farmers who would basically overspread the continent. That's not what the Federalists want. The Federalists want to manufacture goods. And what's interesting is that in the end, we tend to remember Thomas Jefferson, but in many ways we live in Alexander Hamilton's world. Jefferson's vision for the United States did not come to fruition. We did not become a land of small-scale farmers who basically lived off the land and they manufactured enough crops just for themselves. They might make enough crops to engage in some trade, but we weren't necessarily going to manufacture all these goods. In the end, the Industrial Revolution is going to change all that, and Alexander Hamilton will get his way, albeit he'll be dead. He's shot by Aaron Burr, by the way, Alexander Hamilton is. But there are multiple reasons for these political divisions. One of them, of course, will also take place during John Adams' administration. You'll see with the Alien and Sedition Acts. And we'll get into that. Your reading talks about that. But just note that early on, be very aware that the Washington administration is going to see internal division. Some of this is caused by rebellion, things like the Whiskey Rebellion, where basically a bunch of folks who made a lot of money on whiskey by distilling their corn. What the federal government wanted to do, and again, this was at the behest of Alexander Hamilton, Washington went along with it, is he said in order to bring in revenue, we should tax the citizenry. And one of the things that they taxed was whiskey. And the problem with that is that small farmers could make a lot of money taking their excess corn, which was bulky to travel with, which was not going to reap as much of a cost benefit to them. So they would take this extra corn, they would distill it into whiskey, and then they could make more money that way. Well, when the federal government wants to tax that, that causes a rebellion. It's eventually put down with force. Washington and Alexander Hamilton will actually create a group of men, more men than any number of men that Washington had ever commanded, and he takes it to suppress the rebellion. But what it demonstrates to folks like Hamilton and other elites is that if the federal government doesn't show a strong hand against the people, then what you're going to have is a growing sense of democracy, that the lower classes can rise up and overthrow the aristocracy. Jefferson's kind of in favor of that, Hamilton not so much. And that likewise contributes to the development of political parties. There's a lot of other things that go on during Washington's administration. But ultimately, in the end, Washington and Adams's administrations are hallmark, and they're interesting because they represent kind of this climactic moment when the government is going to set into place a number of precedents that will really shape the future. More so Washington than Adams, but I think Adams needs to have his day. Adams is not so much set to be the president. What I mean by that, he doesn't have the personality for it. He definitely has the resume for it. He's got the pedigree for it. He just doesn't have the temperament for it. He doesn't make great decisions. And again, the Alien and Sedition Acts is really going to demonstrate that. Okay. Probably the lasting legacy of John Adams' administration is he's the father of the Navy. He created the Navy. He recognized the need for a Navy, particularly because of the quasi-naval war with the French, and he realized, hey, we need something like that. So, okay, I've already gone over what I said I would go over, but hopefully that kind of lays some groundwork for you. If you have questions, let me know. But as always, I will say, go in peace. Be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper. May the odds forever be in your favor. All right, guys, have a blessed week and hopefully enjoy the content.